Okay, so welcome to the Tighten Up podcast. We are back. I'm joined by my co-host, Professor from Cal State Fullerton, Whitney. So say hello to everybody.
Hey everyone, welcome to this gloomy SoCal Friday. It's okay.
Okay, so last week, if you all joined us, we discussed the role of high intensity, and the takeaway from our discussion was too much of that could be a bad thing, but doesn't mean that there aren't times you shouldn't push. So hopefully everyone that listened to that episode kind of take away that it's not so black and white. There's a lot of variables that you have to consider, and one point that Whitney brought up that was really valid was just the efficiency of high intensity. And if time is something that you're worried about as far as your fitness, or if you're a college athlete, then maybe some high intensity stuff could be really beneficial to save you a lot of time, and we're going to discuss some of those things today. Anything that you walked out of the podcast, Whitney?
Yeah, definitely. I mean, again, it just depends on your athlete, who you're working with, what season they're in. You need, again, you're going to see and hear from us every single podcast. It depends. There's going to be a lot of it depends, and so hopefully every time you come into these and watch these, you take away something that can help either better you as your whatever sport you're in, or you as a strength coach trying to become a better strength coach. And again, always let us know something that you're interested in. We're trying to make aerobic work sexy.
Even though we came from Cal State Fullerton, where we were all about the strength and power there.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's kind of just start our discussion for this episode. This episode is centered around discussing, is aerobic type training beneficial to the strength and power athletes? So let's kind of define both of those terms. So strength and power athletes, a lot of times people just think maybe some weightlifting or powerlifting, but to me, I think of even like a basketball as kind of like an intermittent, but there's a lot of explosive type movement. So if you're any type of sport that you have to at some point explode, so think of a soccer game, even though it's a long duration game, there are a lot of times that the key moments of the game has to do is being able to outsprint your opponent, right? So that to me is kind of a definition that I look at what strength and power means. That almost every sport is going to require that. Even something like a marathon, where the last leg of that, the last mile, whatever it may be, or if you're going up a hill, you're gonna have to push it. So it's not. Don't think just because you're a marathon runner that it doesn't require those movements that are going to be pretty explosive, or they're going to push you pretty high as far as your heart rate and things like that. But how else would you maybe look at that strength and power athlete?
Yeah, I mean, strength and power is the athletes that you work with all the time, right? Boxing. Maybe we see, especially working in teaching 351, one of the first things when I give boxing as a sport to groups, and we're talking about testing, their first go-to to test is a VO2 max. Yes, there's some validity to that yes, we do need to know VO2 max, but how much do you really need to know VO2 max? They need to be powerful. Yeah. Right? They've got to pack powerful punches. Yep. Cheer and dance. Their movements are explosive. Yep. I mean, I sat in and watched their practice, their actual in-sport practice yesterday, and those turns and those jumps and leaps, it's all powerful. All powerful.
Plyometrics, a lot of ballistic type movements. So again, when you're listening to this, don't just think strength and power is like lifting weights and you're just maybe, baseball. So baseball is kind of the one end of the spectrum where that's a pretty much all strength and power. However, today we're going to talk about why you shouldn't just neglect the aerobic type stuff. But that's a perfect kind of definition of a true strength and power sport. You throw a baseball, and then there's 30 to 45 seconds of recovery and so on, and you just repeat that for X amount of time, right? But there's still, and we're going to discuss that today, about the validity of including some type of aerobic type training for those types of athletes, right? So then let's kind of maybe define kind of aerobic type exercise training. I mean, what pops to your head when you think of aerobic, that term?
I mean, the first thing is going to be all those marathons, all those 5Ks that everyone signs up for, that, turkey trot, which we just had Thanksgiving, and then all that in between. So anything within a mile, 3 miles, an hour is what I would consider aerobic. What about you?
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I used to think I just think marathon runner, but I think most sports there's an aerobic component. I
Mhm.
just think it's how you interpret it and the way you look at that term. So again, people listening to this, that's the first thing that probably popped in your head is ultra endurance and that type of stuff. But you'll be surprised when we talk about some of the things today why it's not just continuous type training, but some stuff, even like an interval, there's an aerobic component, and we're going to talk about kind of the recovery aspect of that topic. But yeah, so think of aerobic is something that's going to be not super high as far as your intensity goes, a little bit longer duration, but it's kind of a general term, and there's different ways that you can define it based off of sports, training, and even the mode of training.
Mhm.
Right? Okay, so let's first answer, and again, we're going to kind of go over the podcast is something that we do unique as far as we do a debate, right?
Mhm.
We try to look at both sides of the argument rather than just being super narrow-minded and just looking at it on one side, always trying to play some devil's advocate as to why there might be some beneficial components of things that we might not believe in.
Right.
So Whitney's going to start off, and she's going to take the side and the argument of why it might not be the best thing to do aerobic type training, or maybe the mountain. But go ahead and make your argument as to why why aerobic type training might not benefit strength and power athletes.
All right, so like we keep saying over and over and over, strength and power is sexy, right? And we want to be all strength, all power, all the time. And so I'm going to go with my same argument from last week. HIIT is time efficiency.
So the people that are out there, so what is HIIT?
High intensity interval training.
Got
So again, we mentioned it or touched on it last week. It's a little bit of like, you can add in Tabata, right? So you're working super hard for 20, 30 seconds and a little bit of rest, 10 seconds. And then again, work hard, take a break for 10 seconds, work hard, and you do it over and over and over.
Got it.
And so you're spending minutes in the gym doing that kind of training versus aerobic training where you're maybe looking at an hour
Okay.
in the week. So again, time efficiency is going to be the big argument when it comes to that. And then also with aerobic or long duration type of training, what's going to happen is you're going to increase cortisol levels. And it's a stress type of hormone that occurs. And again, when it comes to exercise and training, we want stress, right? Stress is what's going to help us adapt and become better and make us stronger and faster. But too much cortisol can be a bad thing, right? It promotes muscle loss. It promotes more fat storage, right? And for some of us, we don't want more fat storage, right? We're always trying to figure out how to become lean, mean machines.
Yep.
And then also, what else? It inhibits protein synthesis. So basically, it's going to break down that muscle more. And with HIIT, it's going to help preserve lean muscle mass, right? With HIIT, with high intensity interval training, you're going to decrease body fat, increase lean body mass, and still get some of those same adaptations you would get with aerobic training. So time efficiency, type 2 fibers come in, right? You're preserving those type 2 fibers, whereas with long, slow duration type of training, aerobic training, a chronic aerobic training, you're going to get more type 1 adaptation fibers. So type 1 are your more slow endurance lasting fibers. So that's why our marathon runners are able to perform marathons. They have a high load of type 1 fibers, whereas our strength and power athletes have more type 2 fibers, and those are our strong, powerful fibers. And even as older adults, we want them to have type 2 fibers, right? Because what happens when they're going to fall? They need to be able to react and catch themselves.
And that's an explosive type movement, right?
And an explosive, so you see power and strength everywhere, even with our older adult population, right? And so this is why high intensity interval training can be a lot more effective and important for strength and power.
So you touched on something that, talking about kind of specificity as well, right? So it's like, if you sway too much on the end of the spectrum as far as doing too much aerobic type work, you're going to see a little bit of detriment to kind of your strength and power, and that's your money maker as far as your sport goes. Now, have you found that, is there anything related to maybe the amount of kind of volume, or maybe the amount of time, that if you're doing X amount of cardio type movements, that it has more an effect on any any certain or specific type variable like strength or power? So I'm asking two questions. Is there anything related to how much you're doing, and does those types of movement have an effect on something specific like strength or power, more so than anything else?
Right, so actually what I want to bring up is, and maybe it's a meta-analysis we can post for you guys to kind of take a look at, but it's concurrent training, a meta-analysis examining the interference of aerobic and resistance training exercises. Wilson et al., so we have the article right here, and so we'll get it up posted for you guys to kind of take a look at it.
So what's the title?
Concurrent training, a meta-analysis examining interference of aerobic and resistance training exercises. So basically what a meta-analysis is they took a bunch of studies out there that examined this and kind of put it all together for one place to be able to read them all, instead of printing out lots and lots of different exercise or research articles that talk about it. So they kind of did the hard work for us,
Nice.
which is nice. And one of the things they did mention when it came to strength, hypertrophy, and power, we saw that power had the most effect when it came to aerobic type of exercises. Power was affected the most.
More than like strength?
More than strength and more
Got
than hypertrophy, sorry.
Interesting. Okay.
Mhm.
And then how about the amount or time or anything? Did they look at anything like that? Like how much you did or the time that you did it? That is there like a tipping point that if you're going over X amount of time or distance or volume, that it has more of a negative effect?
Right, so especially when you're training, for those who are training strength and power, going greater than 20 to 30 minutes
Okay.
can show those detrimental effects.
Interesting. So
Right.
there's if you're a strength and power athlete, there's maybe the amount of kind of the threshold or where maybe you don't want to cross, where especially for a power athlete,
Mhm.
like if you're, I think of like a goalie where their sport is strictly explosive power. Now the team might be doing a lot of cardio and conditioning because that's what they do. Now if you're a goalie, you may not want to be joining in and doing the exact same thing, because now it's going to have a detrimental effect on your ability to explode and block a kick. So again, perfect example is if you're playing the same sport, you got to make sure that you're not necessarily just doing what the entire team is. You got to kind of individualize it, or else it can actually, you'll be fit, but as a goalie, you kind of don't need to be quote unquote fit. You just need to be explosive, correct?
Correct.
Yeah.
Correct.
Awesome. So 3 main points were efficiency, the amount of kind of the body composition component, where it's like retaining the lean body mass is what you want. If I'm a 100-meter sprinter, I need some strong glutes, hamstrings, quads. I don't need to lose, a lot, maybe biceps don't have to be as big, but that strength and power coming from my legs is what's going to get me down the line, right?
Yeah.
So efficiency, body composition, and then I think you talked about maybe the concurrent effect as far as doing too much is going to have a detrimental effect, right?
Right.
So great points. So hopefully everyone that's listening, if you're a strength and power athlete, Whitney just made some really good points as far as try to prescribe yourself not so much of it. And then what about the type of cardio that you're doing? Do you think that has any effect, the modes of exercise?
Yeah, so definitely one of the things you want to do if you're going to choose aerobic type of work is choosing something that almost mimics your sport.
Okay.
So it doesn't always have to be going out doing miles and miles and miles. It can be the prowler. It can be sprints. It can be the Airdyne bike. There were a little bit of options that we had mentioned a couple posts back, and we asked you what was your choice of cardio modality.
Yeah.
Mine is the Airdyne bike. I love that thing. There's battle ropes. What are some of your few favorites?
For sure, prowler. And I would say, probably, and then even the rower. I don't like it, but it does kick my butt pretty good because I'm not that efficient with it, and my flexibility is not the greatest. But why is that? Is there a certain reason why those types, does it have to do with just like the concentric and eccentric type movements where it's not kind of tearing you up too much? Like what's the reason behind it?
You're trying to prevent any further breakdown.
Okay.
Right. So one of the studies also, Lundberg et al. He showed that doing resistance training and cycling was actually a lot better as far as
not the concurrent effect one, right?
Right,
It was like
right.
he compared it because like running to biking, right?
Mhm.
It had to do with kind of like the angle of the hip and stuff, right?
Right. And so concurrent, as in doing resistance training exercise, if you give yourself at least 6 hours minimum of rest before you go do that aerobic type of exercise, it shouldn't have any compounding effect on each other. One shouldn't affect the other. And then again, like Coach said, is running versus cycling, and they actually saw less detrimental effects when they chose cycling versus the running option.
Nice. And then so last question, you kind of touched on it. What about like spacing? Like, should we, if I'm a strength and power athlete, do I do cardio first? Do I do it right after? Is there a time? Have they looked at that as far as what would be maybe the ideal, like waiting a certain time in between the two sessions and things like that?
At least greater than 6 hours.
About 6 hours.
There should at least be 6 hours. I personally would choose resistance training first, right? When you go into the gym and you're going to go lift some weights, create power and strength, you want to be as fresh as possible. And so if you go and you kind of beat yourself up from aerobic, which is not bad, right? You won't be able to get the full power and strength effects as if you were to do it first. So
there'll be some like residual fatigue. Got it.
Yeah, so resistance training first, aerobic second.
Got it. Sweet. Okay, so now, so Whitney made some really great points. So my my argument now is gonna kind of go the opposite, where I'm gonna talk about why developing an aerobic base, including some aerobic training, even if you're a strength and power athlete, is going to be beneficial. So for me, it's there's one study that I pulled. The name of it, or the title of it, is The Relationship Between Repeated Sprint Ability, Aerobic Capacity, Intermittent Endurance, and Heart Rate Recovery in Youth Soccer Players. So this is published in 2017. So one of the things that I work with boxers, and one of our main kind of strategies, or at least for me as the strength and conditioning component, has to do with the recovery between bouts, or in their case, rounds, right? So typically in boxing, if you're not familiar, they're boxing, the guys are going to go anywhere from like 4 to 12 rounds. They're going 3 minutes a round, and then they get a minute of rest. So my thinking has always been, all right, they're probably both in somewhat decent shape, both athletes. However, if my athlete can recover either more efficient or even at a faster rate within that 1 minute, they're going into that next round slightly and better, as far as less fatigue. Their technique's not going to suffer as much, and that could lead them into not bringing their hands down and getting caught with that punch that's going to end the fight. So what we do is, the guys are in shape most of the time, but what I want to do is, their ability to recover between these bouts. So this study that I found basically looked at two things that we're going to talk about today. So they separated two groups. They're both soccer athletes, and they classified them as being aerobically fit, or having high fitness levels versus low fitness levels. And the way they distinguished that had to do with their VO2 max score. I think it was 60, so above or below. And what they did basically was they had them do repeat sprint efforts, and the two things that we're going to focus on is their ability to recover within 30 seconds. So they measured their heart rate as soon as they got done with the sprint, and then after 30 seconds they measured it again, and they wanted to see how well that heart rate can drop in between the next sprint. And then they're also measuring the time as far as their sprint ability, and see how far of a drop off they have based off of how fit they were. Mm-hmm. And essentially, to kind of sum them up, they found that the athletes that had the higher fitness level, they had much better performance in both of those. So to me, that's telling me that even though if you're in a sport that has to do repeat high intensity bouts, so basketball, volleyball, baseball, American football, rugby, almost any team sport, that you have to not only do your sprint type training, but you have to build your aerobic base. And then, again, it's always in context. So again, a baseball player is not going to need the same aerobic fitness as a soccer athlete. However, like, they're still going to. I train a golf athlete right now where, they talk about that in the later
up and down with the minivan around their knees, mountain climbers, and then two more. And so I just had them do it repeatedly 4 times in a row until they completed 4, and then saw how fast that they did it, so that when we do that same one again, let's see if we can beat that time as a team, right? And so to work on that, because again, one of the tricky things is only having 45 minutes with them.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, that's something, to me, it's like, I just structure it where I'm always going to do the strength and power work first. For me, it's like, all right, that, like how you touched on earlier, it's like, you can't be fatigued in doing that really explosive type stuff. Right. A lot of the power stuff is all about intent, and if you have a little bit of residual fatigue, like, it's going to affect you. It doesn't mean you should never train power type stuff in a fatigue state, because that's sports. But if you're trying to maximize true power, you have to be fresh, right? And it means, even sometimes you can't superset stuff. Maybe you're doing a little bit of core work, but you're not doing, some explosive jumps or power cleans, and then doing some lunges and then coming back, because you're not going to be as fresh. And you can, we have technology that can measure that. You're just not going to reach those peak velocities on certain movements when you're fatigued. So again, that's best case scenario is to separate them. But again, if you go to a high school, they got an hour, so it's like I would do the strength and power work, the really explosive stuff in the beginning, and then move into maybe some hypertrophy stuff if you have any of that stuff, and then at the end I would do the conditioning. And again, it's sometimes it's the high intensity stuff. You're still getting a lot of the aerobic type benefits, so if that's all you got, then do it. But then there might be other times where they're doing some tempo runs for 15 minutes, and the goal is not to thrash them, to trash them. It's to get them quality work. And that's another thing where I think, and you just posted a video on your Instagram about when people go on the Airdyne, their technique is just really bad. So that's another component of when you just tell someone go all out, first thing they do is their technique just starts to drop. And basically you're engraving bad technique, bad muscle memory when they're in a fatigue state. So if I'm doing that with my boxers, when they get in the ring, that's what their body knows, is just go all out. Don't think about keeping your hands up. Don't think about turning your hips or if you're a soccer athlete, kicking. So it's like you got to be aware of, sometimes it's not just go hard as hard as you can. Go as hard as you can with good technique, right? Because you don't want to engrave those bad movements, and that's what your body does. Whatever it sees it in practice and feels like, it's going to want to do in the game or in real life during your performance. Right.
And kind of what you were saying too about, sometimes I'm not always trying to thrash my girls, right? I'm not trying to run them in the ground all the time. Again, it's not always what tomorrow brings. It's how is this going to help them for their peak performance in January. Right? And so sometimes there have been days when, if I know that they had a couple of days of doing their routines for the men's basketball team, women's basketball team, and then they've been having their own sport practices, and then they come to me and they're just already like thrown into the ground, I bring in the aerobic work. I bring in the concentric type of stuff training. Things that's not going to overwork them. It's still going to work them. I'm still getting some sort of benefit, right? But I'm not trying to trash them. I'm trying to get them to become, again, bigger, faster, stronger for later down the road. So there is a benefit to it.
Yeah, and you talk about that recovery aspect where it's like there's some technology out there that basically it's called heart rate variability, and it tracks kind of your readiness, and it gives you a score. But what I also do is I just tell my athletes to check their resting heart rate in the morning. And if it's in the 50s to 60s, that's actually pretty good. Right. If it's in the 80s, 90s, that can mean that your body's just not. You had really poor quality of sleep, not enough food, or you're getting overworked. So maybe that's a good day to throw in and have like a tempo run where you tell the athletes, hey, right now is not the time where you just go hard and pull back a little bit. Just maintain a certain heart rate or whatever it may be. So I think that's important and to structure your training around the time of the year. So one thing we haven't talked about, but it's just periodizing your training, and that goes along with kind of the concurrent type stuff where if you're trying to peak and maybe muscle mass is a good thing, you should be reducing the volume of aerobic type work, because the main kind of goal is muscle mass. And if you're still having high loads or high volume of aerobic type work, it's probably going to be a detriment to that muscle mass. So maybe that's where you throw in more high intensity type sprints and low volume type stuff, where it's not affecting your quality of muscle mass and things like that. So periodization,
pushing out. I mean, if you want to have that longer aerobic type of work, right? If you want to push more than 20, 30 minutes, maybe that's something you save post-season or even off-season, right?
Yep.
That's when they can afford that kind of thing the most. So that's like high volume running, right? The high volume running is making it long duration, 20, 30, 40 minutes long, in comparison to even resistance training. When we talk about lifting weights, the more volume you have, so if we're lifting at 12 reps, 15 reps, you kind of keep that even off more to the like pre-season, off-season range, right? Where they can afford to being a little more sore and recover and come back and again be bigger, fast, stronger. And then once you start getting closer into season, right, that's when we start bringing in the high intensity type of aerobic work, or that's when we start bringing down the volume and do strength training, right? We're not at 12 reps, we're at 8 reps, we're at 6 reps.
Got it.
And so with resistance training, aerobic training, same concept of bringing that volume down, keeping the intensity high. What part of the season are you in for your athlete?
Yep. And what's the priority of that at that time of the year, of the season, whatever it may be, right? So I think, so I mean, I think we made some good points as far as, let's kind of maybe sum up this talk as far as, so kind of what we found as far as the research is, too much could be a detriment, right?
Yep,
But
yep.
not enough could also be a detriment, right? So it's really finding that balance of how much is enough, are you able to recover? But again, like we always talk about in our podcast, is just it really depends.
Mm-hmm.
You got to look at it in context where it's like, all right, where are you at during the year? Do you have any, if you just got injured, especially like maybe your hamstring, it might not be a smart idea to do high intensity type stuff. And that's where maybe your aerobic type stuff comes in handy. You build that GPP base, and then you move into more of the higher intensity type stuff, right? But anything else as far as practical recommendations? I mean, I think we gave everyone some good practical stuff, but anything else that you could think of?
Yeah, I mean, I hope that you take this and try to implement with your own team, right? If there's importance of everything, you just got to determine when and where is the right time. Just depends.
Yeah, and I would definitely encourage everyone listening to this to try that heart rate recovery.
Yeah.
Again, to me, it's not so much how hard you can push, the how high you can get your heart rate. That's not so important. It's more your ability to recover and be ready for the next performance, for the next lift, for the next sprint, the next kick, or whatever it is. And that's what sports is about. Sports is about repeat efforts of high technical type movements, lowers your risk of injury, but also your ability to throw a baseball as hard as you can, or kick a PK at the end of the game where everyone's tired and that goalie's more fatigued than you are, and you can make this kick. So I think it's try that heart rate recovery, where you're checking your heart rate as soon as you get done with the interval. Check it for 30 seconds and 60 seconds. Measure it, track that over time, and see if you're getting better with that. So again, you can do it with a heart rate monitor, or you can just do it with your fingers and just check it at your neck. Just make sure you can check it correctly, because if not, you might miss a few beats, especially if you're helping to buff it. So practice that, and it is a skill as well.
Right. Don't use your thumb to check.
Yeah. Why is that?
Your thumb has a little pulse too, so
nice.
Careful what you choose.
Cool. So we are finishing up this podcast. So we'll be back on next week, and we'll be discussing a different topic. So thank you all for joining us. This is Coach Jerry. You can find me on Instagram at Coach_Jerry with a J _.
And then Coach Whitney or Professor Whitney, whatever setting you see me in. And you can find me at Big Ass Muscles.
What was that?
Big Ass Muscles. Never gets old.
That's awesome. Cool. All right. We are signing off with the Tighten Up podcast. We'll be back on next week. Thank you all for listening.